December 1942. Somewhere in the crystalline blue sky over the Solomon Islands, where the Pacific stretches like hammered metal beneath the tropical sun, inside the belly of a B-17 Flying Fortress, 19-year-old Staff Sergeant Eddie Kowalski stands at his waist gun position. His hands grip the Browning M2 heavy machine gun, 50 pounds of American steel, precision engineering, and devastating firepower. The weapon vibrates like a living thing, eager to speak. Through his gun port, Eddie watches the empty sky, waiting. The bomber formation drones westward at 12,000 feet, 10 aircraft flying in a combat box designed by men who understood geometry better than they understood dying. Behind him, in the radio room, someone's singing "Don't Sit Under the Apple Tree." The voice sounds impossibly young. Then the radio erupts. "Zeros, 10 o'clock high!" Eddie swings his gun left, searching. For a moment, nothing, just sky and distance and the deep throb of Wright Cyclone engines turning four-bladed propellers. Then he sees it. A Mitsubishi A6 M0, painted in mottled green and gray, dropping out of the sun like a hawk after prey. The Japanese fighter slides into view at his 10 o'clock position, maybe 300 yards out, close enough that Eddie can see the red meatball on its fuselage, the blur of its propeller, the glint of sunlight on its canopy. The Zero moves left to right across his field of vision like a dart thrown by God himself, crossing his gun port at something close to 300 miles per hour. Eddie does exactly what every instinct in his body commands. He centers the crosshairs directly on the enemy plane's fuselage, right on that red circle. He can see it perfectly. The target is there, solid and real and threatening. His finger finds the trigger, squeezes. The Browning erupts, brap. The sound tears through the aircraft, through Eddie's chest, through everything. 50 caliber rounds scream from the barrel at 2,900 feet per second, 13 rounds every single second. Spent brass casings eject in a golden waterfall, bouncing off the deck plates. Tracer fire arcs through the air, every fifth round burning magnesium bright, so Eddie can see where his bullets go. He watches every single bullet pass harmlessly behind the Zero. Not close, not near misses that might damage control surfaces or puncture fuel tanks. Clean misses. His tracers drop perfect lines through empty air, converging on where the enemy fighter was a fraction of a second ago, while the actual aircraft continues untouched, unharmed, probably unaware it's even being fired upon. Orchestrated narrative expansion to amplify crisis scope and human impact. Good start. I'm establishing the opening scene with vivid detail following the style guide. Now I need to continue building the crisis, showing this wasn't just Eddie's problem. Let me expand on the scale of the issue and the human cost, then transition into the analysis of what was happening. The Japanese pilot doesn't take evasive action, doesn't break left or right, doesn't roll or climb. He just keeps flying his original course, completely untouched, as Eddie's ammunition counter spins down to empty. The Zero fires a single burst into the formation. Somewhere ahead, someone screams, then breaks away, diving back toward the sun, gone as suddenly as it appeared. Eddie stands at his gun, breathing hard, hands still gripping the weapon. Cordite smoke fills the fuselage. His ears ring from the concussion. 130 rounds fired in 10 seconds of engagement. Zero hits. This wasn't Eddie Kowalski's failure. This exact scene, this same frustrated, deadly futility played out thousands of times across every theater of World War II during those early years. Over the Pacific, over Europe, over North Africa and the Mediterranean. American gunners, well-trained, motivated, equipped with the finest machine guns ever manufactured, were missing, not occasionally, not sometimes, constantly, systematically, with a consistency that suggested something far more fundamental than bad luck or poor training. The numbers, when they finally arrived, were catastrophic. In early 1943, the Army Air Forces conducted an extensive study analyzing gun camera footage from bomber missions over Europe and the Pacific. Teams of analysts sat in dark rooms, running film reels over and over, counting impacts, measuring missed distances, tabulating the brutal mathematics of aerial combat. The results shook the command structure to its foundation. Trained aerial gunners were achieving hit rates below 4% against crossing targets. 4%. That number sat in official reports like an accusation. For every 100 rounds fired at an enemy aircraft moving perpendicular to the gunner's position, 96 bullets were hitting nothing but air. Let that sink in for a moment. 4 hits per 100 rounds. The mathematics became brutal when you ran them out to their logical conclusion. A typical engagement lasted 8 to 12 seconds, the span of time that it took an enemy fighter to cross a bomber's defensive zone before breaking off or moving out of effective range. The Browning M2 fired roughly 800 rounds per minute in sustained bursts, about 13 rounds every single second. In 10 seconds of engagement, a gunner could theoretically put 130 rounds into the air. With a 4% hit rate, that meant 5 bullets might actually strike the target. 5 hits. Now consider what 5 50 caliber bullets could do to a combat aircraft. The answer is not nearly enough. A Zero, light and maneuverable but notoriously fragile, could absorb dozens of hits and keep flying if none struck critical systems. A German Focke-Wulf FW-190, built like a flying tank, could take dozens of rounds and return home. The Luftwaffe pilots joked that their aircraft were held together by armor plate and spite. They weren't far wrong. To reliably down an enemy fighter required sustained hits, 20, 30, sometimes 50 rounds into critical areas: engine, cockpit, fuel tanks, control surfaces. You needed concentration of fire, sustained accuracy, the kind of gunnery that 4% hit rates couldn't provide. The human cost, when you calculated it, became staggering. In 1943 alone, the 8th Air Force, flying strategic bombing missions over Europe, lost an average of 188 bombers per month. Each B-17 carried 10 men. That's 1,880 air crewmen killed, captured, or missing every 30 days. 22,560 casualties over the course of a year. Men in their early 20s, most of them. Boys who should have been in college or learning trades or starting families. And a significant percentage, nobody knew exactly how many, but the estimates ran between 20 and 30%, of those losses came from bomber formations that couldn't effectively defend themselves against fighter attacks. Aircraft that died because their gunners, brave and trained and determined, simply couldn't hit fast-moving targets that common sense and every human instinct said should be easy to destroy. The gunners were doing everything right according to their training. They tracked their targets properly. They maintained sight picture the way their instructors taught them. They controlled their bursts, not just holding down the trigger and spraying ammunition, but firing in measured 3 to 5 second bursts to prevent barrel overheating. They stayed at their positions even when their aircraft shuddered from flak impacts, even when engine fires broke out, even when wounded men screamed for medics. The problem wasn't courage. It wasn't commitment. It wasn't the quality of American gunnery training or the determination of American servicemen. The problem was physics. And physics didn't care about bravery. Every gunner, every single one, instinctively aimed directly at what they could see. It made perfect, intuitive, obvious sense. You point at the thing you want to hit. You pull the trigger. The thing gets hit. That logic works fine when you're shooting at a stationary target on a rifle range, working through basic marksmanship fundamentals. It even works when you're hunting deer in the Pennsylvania woods, a white-tailed deer moving at 20 miles per hour through the trees. But enemy fighters weren't deer. They were crossing the gunner's field of view at speeds exceeding 300 miles per hour. The late-war German jets, the Me-262s that started appearing in the skies over Germany in 1944, could hit 540. At those velocities, the time required for a bullet to travel from the gun muzzle to the target's position meant the target wasn't there anymore by the time the bullet arrived. The bullet itself moved fast, roughly 2,900 feet per second, leaving the barrel of a Browning M2. That sounds instantaneous. At short ranges against slow targets, it effectively was instantaneous. But in aerial combat, short range meant 200 to 400 yards, and the targets were screaming through the sky at speeds that would have seemed impossible just 20 years earlier, in the biplane era of World War I. Consider, a Zero flying at 300 miles per hour covered 440 feet every single second. Do the math on a 300-yard shot. That's 900 feet. At 2,900 feet per second, the bullet needed roughly 0.31 seconds to cover that distance. Doesn't sound like much, does it? Not quite a third of a second. The time it takes to blink. But in those 0.31 seconds, that Zero moved another 136 feet forward. 11 car lengths. An entire football field from goal line to the 40-yard line. The gunner aimed at where the aircraft was, but the bullet arrived at where the aircraft had been a third of a second earlier, passing through empty air while the enemy fighter continued unscathed toward its target. This phenomenon had a name: deflection error. Military scientists and ballistic experts understood it in theory long before World War II. The mathematics were covered in advanced gunnery courses at various military academies. Officers with technical backgrounds knew the equations, could solve the trigonometry, understood the underlying physics. But understanding something in a classroom, working it out with pencil and paper and theoretical scenarios, was entirely different from solving it in combat, in the sky, at altitude, while being shot at, while your aircraft bucked through flak damage, while your oxygen mask fogged at 25,000 feet and your hands shook from cold and adrenaline. The deflection required wasn't some minor adjustment, some slight correction that could be estimated and applied intuitively. It was massive, counterintuitive. Against a target crossing at 90 degrees, perpendicular to your line of sight at 300 yards distance, a gunner needed to aim approximately 15 to 20 feet ahead of the aircraft's nose. 15 to 20 feet of empty sky.
That meant putting your crosshairs on what looked like nothing. Absolutely nothing. No aircraft visible in your sights, just blue sky or gray clouds or the black emptiness of night. You had to trust that the target would fly into your stream of bullets, trust mathematics you couldn't see, trust physics that contradicted every signal your eyes were sending to your brain. Every human instinct screamed against it. Your target is there, right there in front of you, solid, real, threatening, 300 yards away and getting closer with every heartbeat. You can see the pilot in the cockpit. You can see his guns beginning to flash. And your training manual is telling you to aim at empty space 20 feet ahead of where he actually is. It felt insane. It felt wrong. It felt like the kind of mistake that would get you killed. Gunnery instructors tried teaching deflection shooting during stateside training. Starting in 1942, as reports from combat theaters began filtering back about terrible hit rates, the training command implemented new curricula designed to address the problem. The Army Air Force's Flexible Gunnery School at Laredo, Texas, put students through rigorous programs. Trainees spent hours in turret simulators, cramped metal compartments that rotated and elevated, giving students a feel for how aircraft turrets moved. They shot at towed targets from the backs of moving trucks, trying to replicate the experience of firing from a mobile platform. They studied diagrams showing proper lead angles, mathematical tables that broke down deflection by target speed, range, and crossing angle. None of it translated effectively to real combat. The problem was complexity. Deflection wasn't a single calculation that could be memorized and applied. It changed constantly, dynamically, depending on a dozen variables that shifted every second. Target speed. But which speed? The enemy's airspeed, or his ground speed, or his closing speed relative to your own aircraft's movement? Target angle. But which angle? His heading relative to the horizon, or his aspect relative to your gun position? Range. But how do you judge range accurately when there's nothing but air between you and the target? No landmarks, no reference points. And whether the target was climbing or diving, whether your own aircraft was turning, which changed the relative motion, whether you were firing from a turret that could rotate 360 degrees or from a fixed position limited to a narrow arc of fire. A B-17 ball turret gunner hanging beneath the aircraft in a plexiglass sphere, the most exposed and vulnerable position on the bomber, engaging a Bf-109 making a frontal attack from 12 o'clock, needed completely different deflection than the same gunner engaging the same aircraft type during a beam attack from 3 o'clock. And he had maybe 4 seconds to process all those variables while being shot at, while his aircraft bucked through turbulence and flak damage, while his oxygen mask fogged up at 25,000 feet, while the temperature inside that ball turret dropped to 30 below zero. 4 seconds to do mathematics that would take 10 minutes with pencil and paper in a quiet classroom. It was impossible. The human brain simply couldn't process trigonometry at combat speed. The psychological barrier proved just as deadly as the technical one. Gunners who survived their first few missions, already a minority given the loss rates, and tried implementing deflection shooting during combat, often abandoned the technique after apparent failures. Here's what would happen. A gunner, remembering his training, would spot an enemy fighter approaching at his 9 o'clock. He'd rotate his gun, track the target for a moment, then deliberately aim ahead, putting his sight picture on empty sky a plane length or two in front of the fighter's nose. He'd fire a burst, and he'd watch his tracer rounds arc through that empty sky, nowhere near the enemy aircraft. From his perspective, he'd led too much. His tracers went in front of the target. So next engagement, he'd reduce his lead, move his aim point closer to the visible aircraft. Self-correcting. Except he was self-correcting in exactly the wrong direction. What he couldn't see, what the tracer rounds didn't show him, was that even his too far ahead aim point was actually behind where it needed to be. The tracers looked like they were leading the target because they curved forward in his field of vision. But by the time those bullets reached the target's altitude, the target had already moved past that point in space. It was an optical illusion that killed men. The gunner trusted his eyes over the physics he couldn't see, and his eyes, shaped by millions of years of evolution to track animals moving at terrestrial speeds, lied to him. Gun camera footage from 1943 missions, black and white film shot through synchronized cameras mounted near gun positions, shows this pattern repeatedly. A gunner would open fire with some forward lead, his tracers would appear to pass ahead of the target. Next burst, less lead. Third burst, even less lead. By the fourth or fifth burst, he'd be shooting directly at the target's current position, sometimes even slightly behind it, chasing the fighter's tail through the sky. The casualties mounted. The numbers became impossible to ignore. October 1943, the 8th Air Force launched the second raid on Schweinfurt deep in southern Germany. Schweinfurt produced ball bearings, tiny precision components essential for everything from tank transmissions to aircraft engines. Destroy Schweinfurt's factories and you could cripple German war production. That was the theory.
291 B-17s and B-24s took off from English airfields.
They flew without fighter escort. The P-47 Thunderbolts and FW-190s from multiple Jagdgeschwader wings, coordinated by ground radar stations, vectored in for mass attacks. The formation's defensive fire, even with hundreds of machine guns firing thousands of rounds, couldn't stop them. 60 bombers failed to return. 20% losses. 600 men killed or captured in a single mission. The survivors landed at their English bases with dead and wounded crewmen, shredded hydraulic lines, engines trailing smoke, control surfaces shot to pieces. Fire crews pulled bodies from ball turrets and tail gun positions. In the debriefings, interrogations really, though they called them debriefings, gunners reported the same frustration over and over. They'd been shooting. Their guns had been working. They'd tracked targets properly, maintained their positions, followed their training. But their bullets hadn't been connecting. Fighters they'd fired at would break away untouched, loop around, and make another pass.
Something fundamental had to change, and it had to change fast. Because at the current loss rates, at 20% casualties per mission, the entire Allied strategic bombing campaign would collapse before Christmas, before it ever reached Berlin, before the bomber offensive, which Churchill and Roosevelt had promised Stalin would open a second front in the West, could achieve anything meaningful. The mathematics were simple and brutal. You couldn't win an air war if you couldn't hit enemy aircraft. And American gunners, despite their courage and determination and the finest technology could produce, couldn't hit enemy aircraft. The solution, at least the theoretical solution, had been sitting in a filing cabinet in the War Department's archives since 1924, written by a man most combat aircrews had never heard of. His name was Lieutenant Colonel James Puckle. Not the historical James Puckle who invented the defense gun in the early 1700s, that odd revolving weapon designed to fire round bullets at Christians and square bullets at Turks, because apparently geometry was theology in the 18th century. No, this was a different man entirely. An American artillery officer with a gift for ballistics and a terrible talent for being right about things nobody wanted to hear. James Puckle, the American one, the one that matters to our story, had been an instructor at the Army's Field Artillery School at Fort Sill, Oklahoma in the early 1920s. He'd served in France during World War I, commissioned straight out of West Point in 1916, just in time to experience the last hurrah of horse-drawn artillery and the first terrible glimpse of modern mechanized warfare. In France, Puckle witnessed something that fascinated and disturbed him. The first clumsy attempts at air-to-air combat. Pilots taking pot shots at each other with pistols and rifles. Machine guns jerry-rigged to fire through propeller arcs. The whole thing seemed chaotic and primitive, which it was. But Puckle, who thought in mathematics the way most men thought in words, recognized something nobody else seemed to notice. Aircraft speeds were increasing exponentially. The SPAD-13 fighter that dominated the skies in 1918 could hit 138 miles per hour, faster than any human being had ever traveled before the invention of the train. And aviation technology was advancing so rapidly that within a decade, fighters would be twice that fast. Within 2 decades, perhaps 3 times as fast. Puckle ran the calculations. He sat down with ballistic tables, aircraft performance specifications, and a slide rule. And he arrived at a conclusion that must have seemed almost apocalyptic to anyone who understood its implications. Within 10 years, by the early 1930s, aerial combat would become impossible using conventional aiming techniques. In 1924, Puckle published his findings in a technical paper titled The Problem of Lead in Aerial Gunnery. It wasn't a classified document. Anyone in the Army could request a copy. But it was technical, dry, full of equations and graphs and terminology that made the eyes glaze over. The kind of paper that military officers filed away with the intention of reading someday, then forgot about. Puckle wasn't some theoretical academic disconnected from reality. He'd stood in French mud while artillery shells whistled overhead. He'd watched men die because their weapons and tactics hadn't adapted to modern warfare. He understood that the gap between what worked in peacetime manuals and what worked in combat could be measured in body counts. His paper laid out the mathematics with brutal clarity. Puckle demonstrated that as aircraft speeds increased beyond 150 miles per hour, the deflection angles required would exceed human intuitive capability. Not human physical capability, the eye could track that fast, the hands could move that quickly. Intuitive capability. The ability to look at a moving object and instinctively understand where to point your weapon to hit it. He calculated specific examples. Against a target moving at 250 miles per hour at a perpendicular angle, crossing at 90 degrees to the gunner's line of sight, a gunner would need to aim approximately 4 to 5 aircraft lengths ahead of where he could see it. Aim at a point in empty space where the aircraft would arrive roughly half a second in the future. Thread a needle that was moving at 250 miles per hour, and that was at 250. Puckle correctly predicted that by the late 1930s, fighters would routinely exceed 300 miles per hour, at which point the deflection requirements would become even more extreme.
His paper included exhaustive tables, pages of them, charts showing required lead distances for various combinations of target speed, range, and crossing angle. 200-yard shot at a 90-degree crossing angle against a 300-mile-per-hour target, lead 47 feet. Same target at 400 yards, lead 94 feet. Same target at 600 yards, lead 141 feet. The numbers were staggering. They suggested that aerial gunnery as currently practiced and as currently taught at every military flight school in the world would become obsolete within a decade. Puckle's conclusion was even more disturbing than his calculations. He argued that without mechanical assistance, without some form of computing device that could calculate deflection automatically and show gunners where to aim, aerial gunners would be effectively useless against modern aircraft. Not less effective, not somewhat handicapped. Useless. The Army filed his paper, thanked him for his thoroughness, and forgot about it. Throughout the 1920s and 1930s, military aviation advanced exactly as Puckle predicted. The biplane fighters of World War I, fabric-covered wooden frames held together by wire and prayers, gave way to all-metal monoplanes with enclosed cockpits, retractable landing gear, and supercharged engines that could push aircraft past 300 miles per hour. The Boeing P-26 Peashooter, America's first all-metal fighter, entered service in 1933 with a top speed of 234 miles per hour. The Seversky P-37 of 1937 hit 282. By 1940, the Curtiss P-40 Warhawk was touching 360, and that was just the beginning. German Bf-109s, Japanese Zeros, British Spitfires, all pushing the boundaries of what aircraft could do. But gunnery training remained frozen in 1918. Instructors taught marksmanship fundamentals as if students were preparing for a rifle competition rather than a three-dimensional chase through the sky at 300 miles per hour. Sight picture, trigger control, breathing technique. The same skills that won medals at Camp Perry, the same techniques that had worked fine for infantry snipers, the same methods that made sense when your target was standing still on a hillside at 600 yards. The few voices advocating for advanced deflection training were dismissed as alarmists, overthinkers, men who'd spent too much time in classrooms and not enough time in cockpits. After all, the reasoning went, Americans had always been excellent marksmen. It was part of the national mythology.
Daniel Boone shooting squirrels from trees, Annie Oakley hitting playing cards in Buffalo Bill's Wild West show, Alvin York single-handedly capturing 132 German soldiers in the Argonne, the frontier tradition of sharpshooting. Surely those skills would translate to aerial combat with proper practice. They didn't. When the United States entered World War II on December 7, 1941, the smoke still rising from Pearl Harbor, the battleships still burning, the Army Air Force's gunnery training program was catastrophically unprepared for the reality of modern air combat. The standard training program lasted 4 weeks, 28 days. Students fired roughly 1,000 rounds total during their entire qualification course. Most of that ammunition went towards stationary targets or slowly towed sleeves, long fabric streamers pulled behind training aircraft at predictable speeds along predictable flight paths, maybe 150 miles per hour in straight lines. Not a single training scenario replicated the chaos of a Focke-Wulf FW-190 diving through a bomber formation at 400 miles per hour while executing a barrel roll. Not one drill prepared gunners for the disorientation of watching tracers curve away from where you thought they should go. Nobody taught the counterintuitive mathematics of aiming at empty sky. Graduates received their wings, climbed into B-17s and B-24s, flew to England or the Pacific, and discovered their training was worthless the first time a zero flashed across their gun sight like a phantom. The casualties piled up through 1942 and into 1943. The reports came back, the gun camera footage accumulated, and finally, desperate commanders started digging through old technical libraries, searching for anything that might help, any research, any theory, any forgotten study that might explain why American gunners, equipped with the best weapons in the world, couldn't hit German fighters. Captain Robert Williams, assigned to the 8th Air Force Gunnery Analysis Section at an airfield in eastern England, found Puckle's paper in the archives at Wright Field in Ohio. Someone had requested a copy, had it sent over. Williams read it in one sitting, probably in some cold Quonset hut office, wearing his flight jacket against the damp England winter, a single lamp on his desk. When he finished, he drafted a memo to his commanding officer. The memo itself has been lost. So many documents from that era were destroyed or misfiled or simply vanished in the chaos of war. But several people who saw it later remembered one detail. 2 words underlined 3 times in Williams' handwriting. He knew. Puckle had predicted this exact disaster 18 years before the first B-17 ever flew a combat mission over Europe. His calculations were still accurate, his warnings had been correct. Every single thing he said would happen had happened, exactly as he'd described. And hundreds, thousands of American air crewmen had died because nobody had listened. The question wasn't whether Puckle had been right. The mathematics were indisputable. Anyone with a slide rule in basic physics could verify his calculations. The question was whether anything could actually be done about it now, whether it was possible to fix this problem while the war was still being fought, whether you could teach gunners to consciously calculate deflection angles while being shot at, while their aircraft shook from flak impacts, while their friends bled out in adjacent gun positions. The human brain couldn't process trigonometry at combat speed. Everyone knew that. The body couldn't do what the mind could calculate. But if conscious calculation wouldn't work, maybe, just maybe, something else would. The British had already started finding answers, born from the same desperation, forged in the skies over southern England during the summer of 1940, when the entire fate of Western civilization hung on whether a few thousand young men could stop the Luftwaffe.
And in that crisis, in those desperate months, someone had discovered something remarkable about how human beings actually learn to hit moving targets. The answer didn't come from scientists or engineers. It came from a fighter pilot who'd spent his peacetime years shooting clay pigeons at country estate competitions.
A man who understood that the best marksmen in the world didn't think about what they were doing. They just did it. RAF Squadron 609 flew Supermarine Spitfires out of Middle Wallop Airfield, a grass strip in Hampshire where sheep grazed between the runway and the perimeter fence. Beautiful aircraft, the Spitfires. Elliptical wings that look like they'd been designed by someone who understood both aesthetics and aerodynamics. Rolls-Royce Merlin engines that produced a sound halfway between a growl and a scream. Armed with 8 Browning 303 machine guns, 4 in each wing, synchronized to converge their fire at 250 yards. The pilots were brave. Their aircraft were magnificent, perhaps the best fighter in the world at that moment. But they were missing. Flight Lieutenant John "Cat's Eyes" Cunningham, he'd get that nickname later after night fighting missions, reviewed gun camera footage from July engagements. These cameras, mounted in the aircraft's wings, activated when the pilot pressed the trigger. They captured what the guns saw, where the pilot aimed, whether he hit. Cunningham spent hours in the intelligence officer's darkroom, running film reels over and over, watching tracers arc through empty sky, counting impacts, measuring missed distances, tabulating the brutal mathematics of aerial combat. The squadron's hit rate against crossing Messerschmitts was hovering around 6%. 6 hits per 100 rounds fired. The Spitfire carried enough ammunition for roughly 16 seconds of sustained fire, 300 rounds per gun, 2,400 rounds total at a combined firing rate of about 150 rounds per second. Pilots were burning through their entire combat load and watching German fighters fly home untouched. Squadron leader Horace "Tubby" Darley, he'd earned the nickname at flight school before rationing made everyone thin, commanded 609 Squadron. Darley was 31 years old, which made him ancient by fighter pilot standards. Most of his young lions were barely 22. But Darley had something his young lions didn't: experience outside of aviation. Before the war, he'd been a competitive clay-pigeon shooter, serious competition, national level. He'd spent hundreds of hours at country estate shooting grounds, calling for targets, watching orange discs arc through the air at unpredictable angles, pulling the trigger at exactly the right moment to intersect birdshot with clay. And he understood something about leading moving targets that military theorists had completely overlooked. The best shotgun shooters didn't calculate lead. They didn't do mathematics, didn't consciously measure the target's speed and trajectory and work out the physics in their heads, didn't think about muzzle velocity or shot spread or time of flight. They felt it. Their brains processed the target's movement subconsciously, pattern recognition happening below the level of conscious thought. Their hands moved the gun barrel ahead of the clay disc without deliberate calculation, muscle memory, instinct, the same way you catch a ball without solving trajectory equations. Darley wondered if fighter pilots could learn the same instinctive response. In early August 1940, right in the middle of the Battle of Britain, when every fighter and every pilot was desperately needed in the air, Darley made a radical decision. He grounded his entire squadron for 3 days, took them off the combat rotation, and conducted live fire experiments that violated every standard in the RAF training manual. The experiments were brutally simple. Darley had a Hawker Hurricane fighter aircraft, an older, slower aircraft being phased out of frontline service, tow a target banner across the gunnery range. The banner was canvas, maybe 20 feet long, painted in bright colors so it showed up against the sky. The Hurricane would fly straight and level at various speeds while Darley's Spitfire pilots made repeated firing passes. But instead of the standard approach, pilots slowing down, getting into perfect position, carefully aiming, trying to calculate the precise lead angle, Darley instructed them to do something that sounded completely insane. "Don't aim at all," he told them. 22-year-old pilots who'd been drilled in marksmanship fundamentals since basic training.
who'd been taught that accuracy came from careful aiming and controlled breathing and steady trigger pressure. Don't aim. Instead, he said, watch the target's movement naturally and start firing while your aircraft is still turning to follow, while you're still in the roll, before you've steadied on target. Let the deflection happen naturally through the motion of your turn, rather than trying to consciously create it with aiming adjustments. Fire into where your instincts say the target is going, not where your eyes say it currently is. The first attempts were disasters. Pilots missed the banner by 50 feet. Their bullets stitched patterns across empty sky, tracer rounds making elegant curves that connected nothing to nothing. One pilot, a kid from Manchester who'd washed out of university to join the RAF, got so frustrated he nearly flew his Spitfire into the hillside.
But Darley made them repeat the exercise, again. 40 passes each pilot over 3 days. No lectures about ballistics, no trigonometry, no tables of deflection angles. Just repetition with one simple instruction. Fire while you're still moving, not after you've steadied on target. By the third day, something remarkable happened. The pilots' hit rates began climbing. Not dramatically at first. They went from 6% to maybe 8%, then 10, then 12. But that was a doubling. That meant twice as many bullets hitting German aircraft, which meant twice as many kills, twice as many damaged enemy fighters returning to base unable to fly the next mission. The improvement wasn't random, it wasn't luck, it was learning. Their subconscious minds, given enough repetitions, were beginning to solve the deflection problem automatically, processing the angular velocity of the target, calculating the required lead, moving their hands to the correct position, all without conscious thought. Darley documented his results and submitted them to Fighter Command Headquarters on August 18, 1940. His report included a crucial observation that would change how the RAF thought about aerial gunnery. The pilots who improved fastest weren't the ones with the best peacetime marksmanship scores. They weren't the riflemen, the target shooters, the guys who'd won medals at Bisley. Those pilots, ironically, struggled. They kept trying to apply rifle shooting technique to aerial combat. Steady hold, careful aim, squeeze the trigger gently. The pilots who improved fastest were the ones who could suppress their instinct to aim carefully, the ones who could trust their peripheral vision and motion sense instead of their central focus, the ones willing to feel stupid, to fire at what looked like empty sky, to let their hands do something their conscious mind said was wrong. The conscious brain, Darley argued in his report, was too slow for modern air combat, too deliberate, too wedded to logic and calculation. The answer was training the subconscious to handle deflection automatically, the same way a baseball player's brain calculates where a fly ball will land without consciously solving trajectory equations. The same way you can catch a set of keys someone tosses to you without doing calculus. Fighter Command circulated Darley's findings, but implementation was scattered and inconsistent. Some squadrons adopted the technique enthusiastically, others dismissed it as unscientific nonsense. The RAF's training command was particularly resistant. Their instructors had decades of experience teaching marksmanship fundamentals, and Darley's approach seemed to abandon everything they knew about proper shooting discipline. But combat results didn't lie. Squadrons that embraced motion-based deflection shooting showed measurably better kill ratios through the autumn of 1940. Not overwhelmingly better. This wasn't a miracle cure, but measurable, statistical. The difference between losing the Battle of Britain and winning it. By early 1941, the technique was quietly becoming standard practice across Fighter Command, even if the official training manuals hadn't caught up yet. Even if old guard instructors still lectured about sight picture and careful aiming, the squadrons that fought and survived had learned: trust motion, trust instinct, fire while turning. American military observers in Britain took detailed notes on Darley's methods, wrote reports, sent them back to Washington. But the United States Army Air Forces faced a different problem, a problem that Darley's technique couldn't solve. Fighter pilots could potentially learn instinctive deflection through repetition. They controlled their entire aircraft, could use motion and bank angles to create natural lead, could let their hands follow their eyes, their aircraft following their hands, creating a fluid system where deflection emerged from the geometry of the turn. But bomber gunners couldn't do that. A waist gunner in a B-17, standing at his position in the fuselage, had no control over the aircraft's movement. The bomber flew straight and level through flak. The pilot couldn't maneuver, couldn't roll or dive or turn without breaking formation. And breaking formation meant losing the mutual defensive fire that kept German fighters at bay. The gunner stood in a fixed position. His aircraft flew a fixed course. He had only his hands on the gun and his eyes on the target. No aircraft movement to generate natural deflection. No way to fire while turning because he wasn't turning. The bomber was flying straight toward Berlin while Mess 109 swarmed like angry hornets.
If conscious calculation was too slow and instinctive motion wasn't available, the solution had to be something else.
The solution had to be mechanical. The Massachusetts Institute of Technology occupied a collection of buildings along the Charles River. Bricked in limestone and glass, the architecture of serious thinking. During peacetime, this was where America's brightest minds came to study engineering, physics, mathematics. Where young men learned to build bridges and design machines and solve problems that hadn't existed until someone invented them. But this wasn't peacetime. By 1942, MIT had transformed into a weapons laboratory. The campus buzzed with projects that didn't officially exist: radar development, proximity fuses, fire control computers. Things that would have seemed like science fiction just 5 years earlier, now being built in repurposed classrooms by professors who'd traded chalk for slide rules and urgent military contracts. The Radiation Laboratory occupied Building 20, a temporary wooden structure thrown up in 1942 designed to last maybe 5 years. It would stand for 55, become legendary as the Plywood Palace, and produce more Nobel Prize winners per square foot than almost anywhere else on Earth. But in 1942, it was just a building full of very smart, very tired people trying to win a war. The name Radiation Laboratory was deliberate misdirection. It suggested atomic research, Manhattan Project-type work, which helped maintain secrecy around what Division 7 actually built: fire control systems. The head of Division 7 was Dr. Charles Stark Draper, 40 years old, a mechanical engineer who'd spent the previous decade developing gyroscopic instruments for aircraft navigation. Draper understood something fundamental about the deflection problem that most people were missing. It wasn't really about shooting. It was about prediction. A gun sight needed to show the gunner not where the target currently was, but where the target would be when the bullets arrived, the future position. A point in space that didn't exist yet, but would exist in 0.3 seconds. If you could calculate that future position and display it to the gunner didn't need to understand deflection. He just needed to aim at the glowing dot in his sight. Draper's team started with the mathematics. The equations weren't new. Puckle had worked them out in 1924. But translating equations into physical mechanisms, into something that could be built and mass-produced and installed in 10,000 bombers, that was the engineering challenge. The Mark 14 computing gun sight emerged from Draper's laboratory in prototype form by July 1943. It looked like something from science fiction: a reflector sight, a small pane of angled glass that displayed a reticle to the gunner,
connected to a gyroscope system that weighed 28 pounds and required electrical power from the aircraft's generator. The whole assembly mounted on the gun, adding bulk and complexity to weapons that were already pushing the limits of what a human could physically manipulate. The gunner operated it through a mechanical ranging control, a dial he turned with his left hand while his right hand gripped the gun. The dial had reference marks calibrated to different aircraft types. If he was engaging a 0, he turned the dial until the marks matched a 0's wingspan. If it was a 109, he matched the 109's wingspan. This gave the sight the range information it needed. Then he tracked the target, kept it centered in a small tracking circle in the sight picture for approximately 2 seconds, just 2 seconds. Follow the enemy aircraft. Keep it in the circle. The sight would do the rest. During those 2 seconds, the gyroscope measured the target's angular velocity, how fast it was moving across the gunner's field of view, degrees per second. The instrument could detect movements so slight that human perception couldn't register them, while simultaneously tracking violent maneuvers that would make a human eye lose focus. Here's where it got remarkable. The Mark 14's internal mechanism used a series of cams and gears, analog computers built from machined metal, to solve the deflection equation in real time. It took the range input from the gunner's dial, the angular velocity from the gyroscope, and the known ballistic properties of the .50 caliber round: muzzle velocity, drag coefficient, bullet drop over distance. Then it calculated exactly how far ahead of the target the guns needed to point, and it displayed the result as a lighted reticle that appeared to float in space ahead of the target. The gunner didn't aim at the aircraft anymore. He aimed at the glowing dot. And if he'd ranged correctly, if he'd turned the dial to match the target's wingspan, and if he'd tracked smoothly for those 2 seconds, the dot showed him exactly where to shoot. The Mark 14 solved mathematics that would take a human brain several minutes using pencil and paper, and it solved those equations 30 times per second, continuously updating as the target's angle and range changed, as the target climbed or dove, as it accelerated or decelerated. The gyroscope spun, the gears meshed, the cams rotated, and the reticle moved through the sight picture, leading the target by exactly the right amount.
Testing at Naval Air Station Norfolk, Virginia during August 1943 produced results that seemed almost impossible to the officers observing. They brought in gunners of various experience levels, some veterans with 20 missions, some fresh graduates from gunnery school who'd never fired at anything moving faster than a tow target sleeve. They put them in turret mock-ups with Mark 14 sights, had aircraft fly past at combat speeds and angles, tracked hit rates. Gunners who'd never achieved better than 5% hit rates against crossing targets immediately jumped to 18% with the Mark 14. 18% on their first day using the system, with maybe an hour of familiarization training. After a week of practice, rates climbed above 25%. That was a 5-fold improvement over manual aiming, which translated directly into 5-fold more enemy aircraft damaged or destroyed per engagement, which meant German fighters going down instead of making repeated passes, which meant bombers getting through to their targets instead of being shot down over the North Sea. The Navy ordered the Mark 14 into production immediately, but manufacturing and installing tens of thousands of computing gun sights across the bomber fleet would take time the Allies didn't have. Production facilities needed to be established, workers needed to be trained in precision machining. The gyroscopes required tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. Quality control protocols had to be developed, and the electrical systems in existing bombers needed to be upgraded to power the sights. Production didn't begin in meaningful numbers until early 1944. Installation priority went to new aircraft rolling off assembly lines, B-17Gs and B-24Js with factory-installed Mark 14 sights. Retrofitting existing bombers, the ones already flying missions over Europe and the Pacific, came second. That meant the majority of gunners flying missions through late 1943 and early 1944 were still using basic iron sights, simple metal rings and posts that showed you where the gun was pointing but did nothing to help you calculate where to point it, or crude reflector sights with no computing ability, just a lighted reticle that marked the gun's bore axis. They needed something they could implement immediately, without waiting for new technology, without requiring electrical modifications to their aircraft, without adding 28 pounds of gyroscopes and gears to their gun mounts. They needed a technique that worked with the equipment they already had, a method that could be taught in days instead of months, that didn't require advanced mathematics or mechanical aptitude, that any gunner, even the kid from Iowa who'd worked at a gas station before the war, could learn and apply. The breakthrough came not from engineers or scientists. It came from combat gunners themselves, specifically from the Pacific Theater, where engagement distances were often greater and visibility was often better than over cloud-covered Europe. From men who'd been shot at enough times to develop their own survival strategies, who'd figured out through trial and error what worked and what didn't, who'd kept notebooks because staying alive meant learning and learning meant paying attention. And one of those men was about to change aerial gunnery forever, with nothing more than a pencil, a notebook, and some hand-drawn sketches that would save thousands of lives. His name was Staff Sergeant William "Bill" Fleming. March 1944, USS Lexington, somewhere in the Pacific. The Lexington, CV-16, the second carrier to bear that name after the original was sunk at Coral Sea, cut through blue water at 20 knots. On her flight deck, aircraft maintenance crews worked on SDB Dauntless dive bombers and F-6H Hellcat fighters. The smell of aviation fuel and hydraulic fluid, the sound of prop engines being tested, the endless, organized chaos of a carrier preparing for combat operations. Below deck, in crew quarters that felt like industrialized sardine cans, Staff Sergeant William Fleming sat on his bunk and reviewed his notebook. Fleming was 23 years old, from a small town in Oregon nobody had heard of. He'd been a mechanic before the war. Fixed cars and tractors, the kind of work where you learn to solve problems with limited tools and unlimited stubbornness. Joined the Navy in early 1942, trained as an air gunner, ended up assigned to the Lexington's Air Group support staff. By March 1944, Fleming had flown 31 combat missions. That made him a veteran, a survivor, a statistical anomaly. Most gunners who made it past 20 missions either got promoted to instructor duty or simply ran out of luck. 31 missions meant Fleming had seen things, done things, survived things that should have killed him. He'd been shot down 4 times, once over Rabaul when a Zero put 20mm cannon rounds through his Dauntless's engine, once near Truk when flak took out their tail controls, twice more in incidents he didn't talk about much because the memories made his hands shake. He'd parachuted into the ocean twice, been picked up by submarines once, spent 3 days in a life raft once, eating emergency rations and watching sharks circle. And through all of it, he'd fired approximately 40,000 rounds from various aircraft-mounted machine guns. He'd personally witnessed confirmed hits on 7 enemy aircraft, seen them smoke, seen them burn, seen them spin into the ocean trailing fire. He'd also kept a notebook, military issue, olive drab cardboard cover, lined pages that got soggy in the tropical humidity. The notebook contained something unusual for an enlisted man, technical observations. Fleming wasn't an officer, didn't have a college education, couldn't explain gyroscopic precession if his life depended on it, but he understood machines, and he understood his own successes and failures. The notebook contained sketches, hand-drawn diagrams of enemy aircraft with lines extending forward from their noses, arrows showing where he'd actually aimed during successful engagements, notes about range and angle and target type. Zero at 3 o'clock, crossing right to left, about 300 yards, aimed at 2 plane lengths ahead, 3 hits confirmed in wing route. Val dive bomber, head-on attack, maybe 400 yards, aimed at engine cowling, no hits, should have led more. Betty bomber, crossing 90 degrees, 250 yards, aimed 3 plane lengths ahead, sustained hits, plane smoking, probable kill. He'd measured these lead distances empirically, not with instruments or calculations, but by comparing them to the target aircraft's visible dimensions. 2 plane lengths ahead, 3 plane lengths ahead, using the enemy's own fuselage as a measuring stick. On March 14, 1944, Fleming presented his notebook to Lieutenant Commander Edward Butch O'Hare during a routine debriefing session. O'Hare was already a legend, Medal of Honor, recipient, Navy Cross, the Navy's first flying ace of World War II. He'd single-handedly attacked 9 Japanese bombers in February 1942, protecting the carrier Lexington, and shot down 5 of them in one engagement. They'd name an airport after him later, Chicago O'Hare International. But in March 1944, O'Hare was the Lexington's air group commander, and his job was making sure his pilots and gunners came home alive. O'Hare looked through Fleming's notebook, flipped the pages slowly, studied the sketches, read the notes, and he immediately recognized what he was seeing. Empirical deflection data, gathered under actual combat conditions. Not theoretical calculations from some lab at MIT, not classroom exercises, real information from real engagements, where getting it wrong meant dying. O'Hare called in the Lexington's gunnery officer. "We're implementing this. All gunners, starting tomorrow." The gunnery officer looked skeptical. "Sir, we have established training protocols. Your protocols are producing 5% hit rates. This sergeant is getting hits with manual sights by leading targets with visual references. We're teaching his method to everyone." O'Hare ordered Fleming to conduct training sessions with every gunner in the air group. Not classroom lectures, not technical explanations of ballistics, practical exercises. They called it the spot shooting method. Fleming would have gunners stand at their positions, whether tail gun, waist gun, or turret position. Then another crew member would walk along the flight deck holding a model aircraft on a pole, a little wooden Zero or Betty, maybe a foot long, mounted on a stick. As the model aircraft flew past at various angles, Fleming coached gunners to extend their aim forward by specific increments. "See how wide that Zero is, nose to tail. That's 1 plane length. For a shallow crossing angle, aim 1 plane length ahead. Straight crossing, 90 degrees, 2 lengths. Steep crossing, 3 or more plane lengths." The key was giving gunners a visual reference they could remember and apply instantly. Not numbers, not calculations. Count plane lengths forward from the nose, then fire. A Zero was 30 feet long. If you needed to lead by 60 feet, that was 2 plane lengths. You didn't need to know it was 60 feet. You didn't need to know the target was doing 300 miles per hour or that your bullets would take 0.3 seconds to arrive. You just needed to see that's 2 plane lengths. Simple, visual, immediate. The human brain is exceptional at relative size comparison. We're terrible at absolute distance estimation. Ask someone how far away that mountain is, and they'll be wrong by miles. But ask them if object A is twice as long as object B, and they'll nail it instantly. That's how our visual cortex evolved, comparing sizes of things we can see. Fleming's method exploited that natural ability. The target aircraft provided its own measuring stick. The Zero or Betty or whatever flying past gave you a standard unit of measurement. You just had to project that unit forward into empty space. The Lexington's gunnery officer, still skeptical but willing to try anything, authorized controlled testing during the carrier's operations off Truck Lagoon in late March 1944.
He pulled ammunition expenditure and hit confirmation data for the previous 8 weeks, created a baseline, then tracked the same metrics after Fleming's training program. Watch the numbers. The results were undeniable. Prior to the training, the Air Group's gunners averaged 4.2 hits per 100 rounds fired against crossing targets. By the end of April, just 6 weeks after implementing spot shooting, that rate had climbed to 9.1 hits per 100. The technique had more than doubled their effectiveness. Word spread through the Pacific Fleet with remarkable speed. Navy personnel talked to each other. Gunners who'd rotated back to Hawaii for leave told stories about the Lexington's training program. Squadron commanders compared notes at fleet briefings. By May 1944, variations of Fleming's spot shooting method were being taught aboard the carriers Essex, Enterprise, and Bunker Hill. Each carrier's gunnery officers added their own refinements, but the core principle remained. Give gunners a simple visual measurement system tied directly to the target's apparent size. No calculations, no math. Just count plane lengths, then shoot. The Army Air Forces adopted similar training protocols by mid-1944, though they called it radius of action shooting, a more official-sounding name that meant exactly the same thing. Technical manuals started including illustrations, diagrams showing proper lead distances expressed in multiples of target wingspan or fuselage length. Against a BF-109 at perpendicular crossing angle, lead by 2 to 3 aircraft lengths. Against an FW-190 in a climbing attack, lead by 1.5 lengths. The 8th Air Force Gunnery School at Lavenham, England, rebuilt their entire training program around the technique during June 1944. Instructors who'd spent 2 years teaching careful aiming and steady trigger control had to completely reverse their approach. Don't aim at the target. Aim at where the target is going. Mission loss rates, while still significant, began declining. July 1944 showed 3.4% bomber losses per mission compared to 5.2% the previous October. That difference, less than 2 percentage points, represented hundreds of crew members who flew home instead of dying over Germany. Hundreds of mothers who didn't receive telegrams. Hundreds of young men who got to see 1945. But knowing the technique and executing it under combat conditions remained 2 entirely different challenges. The human brain, even armed with the spot shooting method, still fought against itself when the shooting started. Bovingdon, England, late 1944. Captain Harold Klein sat in a darkened room watching gun camera footage for the 11th time that day. Black and white film, grainy and jerky, showing the view from a ball turret on a B-17 that had flown a mission to Berlin 3 days ago. Klein was an Army psychologist. Before the war, he'd studied behavioral responses at Columbia University, how humans made decisions under stress, how training shaped instinct, the gap between what people knew intellectually and what they did when adrenaline flooded their systems. Now he studied why gunners who could recite deflection shooting principles perfectly during debriefings failed to apply those same principles when German fighters came screaming through the formation. The footage showed a Bf-109 attacking from 11 o'clock high. The gunner's tracers lit up the frame, bright lines converging on, behind the target, every burst. The gunner was shooting at where the 109 had been, not where it was going. Klein made a note in his research log. Subject demonstrates threat fixation collapse at T+4 seconds into engagement. He'd given the phenomenon a name, threat fixation collapse. Gunners would start an engagement using proper deflection. He could see it in the footage. First burst, decent lead. Second burst, less lead. Third burst, shooting directly at the target. By the fourth burst, they were actually behind, trying to catch up to a fighter that was already past them. As the perceived danger intensified, as the enemy fighter closed and the closing speed increased, and the gunner's conscious mind screamed, "That thing is going to kill you," rational technique evaporated, replaced by primal instinct. Point at the threat, pull trigger.
Klein's research identified several factors that accelerated the collapse. Head-on attacks were the worst. When a Bf-109 came straight at you, closing speed exceeded 500 miles per hour. The fighter started as a dot on the horizon and filled your entire field of vision in maybe 3 seconds. In that situation, with your conscious mind convinced you had seconds to live, deflection shooting technique dissolved completely.
Altitude mattered. At 25,000 feet, where oxygen masks restricted breathing and temperatures dropped to 30 below zero, cognitive function declined. The brain, deprived of optimal oxygen, reverted to simpler responses. Complex learned behaviors broke down faster. Experience helped, but only to a point. Gunners with 10 to 20 missions showed improvement over rookies, but they still collapsed under extreme stress. The only ones who maintained proper deflection consistently were the true veterans, 30-plus missions. And there weren't many of those. Most gunners didn't survive 30 missions. The only solution Klein could identify was repetition so extensive that deflection shooting bypassed conscious thought entirely, embedded itself at the same neurological level as walking or catching a thrown ball. Muscle memory, procedural memory, the kind of learning that happens in the basal ganglia and cerebellum, not the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain that doesn't panic because it doesn't think. But that kind of training took time, thousands of repetitions. The military couldn't afford that time in 1942 and 1943 when they needed gunners immediately, needed them by the thousands, needed them yesterday. By late 1944, circumstances had improved enough to extend training programs. Allied control of the air was better. Training pipelines were more established. The desperate urgency of 1943 had eased slightly. The standard gunnery course that had been 4 weeks in 1942 expanded to 8 weeks, then 10. Students now fired 5,000 rounds during training instead of 1,000. And significantly, over half of those rounds went toward moving targets at realistic combat speeds. The Naval Air Gunner School at Jacksonville, Florida, pioneered a particularly effective drill starting in August 1944. They mounted 50-caliber guns on motorized turrets positioned along the waterfront. Then they had high-speed boats, PT boats, motor torpedo boats capable of 40 knots, tow targets across the water. The boats varied their speed and distance and crossing angle randomly, completely unpredictable, just like combat. Gunner trainees engaged these targets repeatedly, 50 to 70 passes per day, every day for a week, until the act of leading became automatic. Instructors didn't correct students verbally during the drills. They didn't lecture. They simply had students shoot, check their hit pattern, adjust, and shoot again. The subconscious learned through feedback loops faster than the conscious mind learned through instruction. Results were measured. Students who completed the program showed hit rates of 18 to 20% immediately upon graduating, before they'd flown a single combat mission. That compared to 5 to 6% for graduates of the older, shorter programs. Elite gunners who survived 30 or more missions demonstrated something remarkable in combat footage analysis. Their deflection aim points remained stable even under intense stress. When a Foch 190 came screaming through the formation with cannon fire flashing from its wings, these experienced gunners maintained their lead automatically. Their conscious minds could be terrified. Many admitted in debriefings to being absolutely convinced they were about to die during certain engagements, but their hands kept the proper sight picture anyway. They'd achieved what martial artists call mushin, no mind, the state where technique happens without conscious direction, where the body moves before the brain decides to move it, where training transcends thinking. A Zen master might describe it as becoming one with the weapon, the gun and the gunner unified, no separation between intention and action. A psychologist might describe it as automaticity, learned behavior executed without conscious monitoring. A veteran gunner from the 91st Bomb Group after his 35th mission described it more simply: you just stop thinking about it. The fighter comes in, you lead it, you shoot. You don't decide to lead it, you just do.
But that level of proficiency took time and ammunition most gunners never received. The mathematics of wartime training were brutal. If creating an expert deflection shooter required 5,000 practice rounds and 10 weeks of intensive training, but the bomber offensive needed 50,000 new gunners in 6 months, compromises were inevitable. The majority of gunners flying combat missions never achieved true unconscious competence. They remained perpetually in what psychologists call the conscious competent stage, capable of proper deflection shooting when conditions allowed them time to think, when the target approached from an expected angle, when they could take a breath, remember their training, count plane lengths, but vulnerable to collapse under extreme stress or when facing unexpected tactical situations. A fighter diving from 7 o'clock high when they'd been scanning 3 o'clock, or an Me-262 jet that appeared and disappeared so fast there was no time to process anything.
This created a strange stratification in combat effectiveness. A bomber formation's defensive firepower wasn't uniform. It depended heavily on which specific gunners were in which specific positions on which specific aircraft. A formation that happened to include several veterans with deep training could fight off attacks that would devastate a formation of newer crews. The veterans' accurate fire would force German fighters to break off early, protecting not just their own aircraft, but the entire formation. German fighter pilots learned to identify and exploit this. They watched the defensive fire during initial passes, targeted bombers that showed hesitant or inaccurate shooting, avoided formations where the defensive fire was immediate, heavy, and precisely placed. The experienced bomber crews nicknamed these veteran formations porcupines, aircraft so bristling with accurate defensive fire that attacking them was suicide. The Germans called them eagle, hedgehogs, dangerous from every angle. But most formations weren't hedgehogs. Most formations had a mix. A few veterans, some experienced gunners, many rookies. And the rookies, despite their best intentions and their courage, still aimed where their instincts said to aim. At the target they could see, not the empty sky ahead of it. The deflection shooting revolution that began with Squadron 609's experiments and American desperation didn't end when World War II concluded in August 1945. The core principle that you must aim where the target will be, not where it is, became foundational to every weapon system developed afterward. The Mark 14 computing gunsight evolved, got smaller, more reliable. The Mark 18, introduced during the Korean War, used improved gyroscopes and more compact electronics. By Vietnam, fighter aircraft carried radar-assisted gun systems that calculated deflection automatically, requiring pilots only to keep targets within acquisition parameters. The F-4 Phantom's lead computing optical sight system did in microseconds what had taken Draper's mechanical gyroscopes significant fractions of a second. Solid-state electronics replacing spinning masses, but the mathematics underneath, still the same. Still solving Puckle's equations from 1924. Modern air-to-air combat has largely moved beyond guns entirely. Missiles handle interception at ranges where deflection would require leading by miles rather than feet. An AIM-120 AMRAAM missile engages targets at 40 nautical miles, beyond visual range, beyond human perception. But the underlying physics hasn't changed, just the implementation. An AMRAAM uses inertial guidance and active radar to continuously update its trajectory toward where its target will be. It's executing deflection calculations thousands of times per second, adjusting its course, compensating for the target's maneuvers, predicting future position based on current velocity and acceleration. It's doing what Eddie Kowalski needed to do over the Solomon Islands in 1942, just faster, more accurately, without human hesitation.
The F-22 Raptor's ANPG-77 radar doesn't just track targets, it predicts their future positions, runs probability calculations on where they're likely to maneuver, then positions the aircraft and selects weapons accordingly. It's the same problem William Fleming solved with hand-drawn sketches in 1944, now handled by computers processing teraflops instead of gunners counting plane lengths. Interestingly, deflection shooting fundamentals remain part of modern fighter pilot training. Despite guns being tertiary weapons in contemporary air combat, the U.S. Navy Fighter Weapons School, Top Gun, still teaches basic fighter maneuvers that include guns-only engagements. Not because pilots expect to dogfight with cannons. They probably won't. Modern air combat happens at distances measured in tens of miles, with missiles guided by radar and computers. But learning to visually predict where a maneuvering target will be develops spatial awareness that applies to every aspect of air combat. A pilot who's mastered deflection shooting intuitively understands closure rates, angle off, lead pursuit curves, concepts that matter whether you're firing a cannon or positioning for a missile shot. The lessons extend beyond aviation, into any domain involving fast-moving targets. Modern anti-aircraft systems are essentially sophisticated implementations of what those 1943 bomber gunners struggled to do manually. The Phalanx CIWS defending naval vessels fires 4,500 rounds per minute, 75 rounds per second at incoming missiles and aircraft. Its radar continuously calculates deflection and updates the aim point.
It's making the same corrections Eddie Kowalski needed, just faster, without the human hesitation that costs so many lives. The CRAM system protecting ground bases in Afghanistan and Iraq? Same principle, different application. Radar tracks incoming mortar rounds and rockets. Computer calculates where they'll be. Gun system fires a cone of 20mm rounds into that future position. Intercepts the threat before it hits. Even video games that simulate combat incorporate deflection mechanics. Games like War Thunder and Digital Combat Simulator require players to lead moving targets manually. And new players experience the exact same frustration 1942 gunners felt. They aim directly at the target, they fire, they watch their tracers pass harmlessly behind, they think, I missed. They aim more carefully next time, shoot directly at the target again, miss again, until eventually they learn, aim at where the target is going. The most skilled players develop the same unconscious competence that combat veterans achieved. Their hands adjust aim without conscious thought. They don't calculate. They don't think. They just know that target needs 3 lengths lead, and their hands move accordingly. The transformation from 4% hit rates in early 1943 to 20+% by late 1944 represents one of the most dramatic tactical improvements of World War II. Achieved not through superior equipment alone, not through overwhelming numbers, but through understanding and working with human cognition rather than against it. Thousands of air crewmen who would have died continued flying. Enemy fighters that would have escaped went down in flames. Bombing campaigns that might have failed reached their targets. All because someone finally acknowledged that human instinct, however strong, could be wrong. That survival meant training people to ignore what felt natural and trust what physics demanded. Consider the casualties prevented. In October 1943, the 8th Air Force lost 5.2% of aircraft per mission. By July 1944, after improved defensive fire had been implemented across the force, losses dropped to 3.4%. That 1.8 percentage point difference doesn't sound dramatic until you calculate what it meant. The 8th Air Force flew roughly 20,000 bomber sorties between October 1943 and July 1944. A 1.8% reduction in losses meant 360 aircraft that came home instead of being shot down. 3,600 crew members who survived. 3,600 men who saw 1945, who came home after the war, who had children and careers and lives. Not all of that improvement came from better gunnery. P-51 Mustangs with drop tanks started escorting bombers deep into Germany, which made a huge difference. But gunnery analysis suggested that improved defensive fire accounted for roughly 30% of the loss rate reduction. That's still over 1,000 lives. 1,000 young men who lived because somebody figured out how to teach deflection shooting effectively. The gunners who learned to aim at empty sky, who forced themselves to fire at nothing visible and trust their bullets would meet metal, proved something essential about human adaptability under pressure. We're not prisoners of our instincts. Evolution shaped those instincts over millions of years, optimized them for throwing rocks at rabbits and spearing fish in shallow streams, for hitting things that moved at speeds measured in miles per hour, not hundreds of miles per hour. Those instincts served our ancestors well, kept them alive long enough to reproduce, got us to the 20th century. But the 20th century demanded something our ancestors never needed: the ability to hit targets moving faster than any living thing ever moved in nature. Targets whose speed would have seemed magical to someone from just 200 years earlier. With proper understanding, sufficient training, and enough desperation, humans rewired their responses, overrode millions of years of evolution, forced their brains to accept a reality that contradicted every signal their senses provided. That lesson, born in blood over Europe and the Pacific, remains relevant anywhere humans confront problems where instinct and solution point in opposite directions. Sometimes the answer isn't to trust your gut. Sometimes your gut is wrong. Sometimes survival means doing the thing that feels insane, aiming at nothing, shooting at empty sky, trusting mathematics you can't see over signals your eyes swear are accurate. December 1944. Over Germany. Staff Sergeant Eddie Kowalski stands at his waist gun position. 2 years of combat, 47 missions, more luck than any man should have. His hands grip the Browning M2, but it's not quite the same gun anymore. He'd requested a Mark 14 sight back in September when they were being installed on new aircraft. Got it in October, spent a week learning how to use it. The formation drones toward Berlin at 23,000 feet. December cold that makes everything brittle. Ice forming on gun barrels. Oxygen masks that chafe your face raw. Fighters, 10 o'clock high. Eddie swings his gun left, searches, finds them. 2 Bf-109s diving out of the sun. Classic German attack pattern. They'll blow through the formation at 400 miles per hour, guns firing, then climb away for another pass. Eddie centers the lead fighter in his sight's tracking circle, turns the range dial to match a 109's wingspan, follows the target for 2 seconds while the gyroscopes spin and the cams calculate and the analog computers solve equations that would fill a chalkboard. The lighted reticle appears ahead of the 109, maybe 3 plane lengths forward, empty sky, nothing visible, just the glowing dot his sight is telling him to trust. Eddie aims at the dot, squeezes the trigger. The Browning erupts, 13 rounds per second. Tracer fire arcs through the cold German sky. And this time after 2 years and 47 missions and 40,000 rounds fired and too many friends dead, this time the bullets connect. The 109's engine cowling sparks, pieces fly off, smoke trails from the cowling, then flames. The fighter breaks left, streaming fire, losing altitude. The pilot probably won't make it back to base. Eddie tracks the second fighter. Range dial, track for 2 seconds, aim at the glowing dot,
Fire. More hits. Not enough to down it. The 109 breaks off, climbing away, but enough to damage it. Enough to send it home for repairs instead of making another attack pass. The formation continues toward Berlin. They'll drop their bombs, turn around, fly back to England. Eddie will survive his 47th mission. He'll fly 4 more before the war ends. He'll go home to Oregon, have kids, live a long life. But right now, in December 1944, at 23,000 feet over Germany, he's just proved something important. You can train human beings to override their instincts. You can teach them to aim at where things will be instead of where things are. You can take boys who grew up hunting deer at 20 miles per hour and turn them into gunners who can hit fighters at 400. Not because they're superhuman, because they learned to trust physics over perception. Because someone figured out how to explain deflection shooting in a way that made sense. Because a forgotten artillery officer in 1924 wrote a paper nobody read until it was almost too late. Because a British fighter pilot who shot clay pigeons figured out that the subconscious learns better than the conscious mind. Because a sergeant from Oregon kept a notebook with hand-drawn sketches. Because engineers at MIT built gyroscopes that could think. Because thousands of gunners learned to aim at empty sky. And because, in the end, human beings are adaptable. We learn. We change. We overcome our limitations when survival demands it. That's the real lesson of deflection shooting. Not that technology saved us, not that better equipment won the war, but that humans, given the right tools and the right training and enough motivation, can learn to do things that seem impossible, can learn to see futures instead of presents, can learn to aim at where the target will be, not where it is.